Hello everyone, today we will descend into the cobbled alleys and shadowed corridors of ancient Rome, where the voice of the people once echoed through the marble halls, and where one man's ambition would end not in glory, but in a pool of blood and dust. Picture this: a restless city buzzing under a sky streaked with Roman red, citizens shouting in crowded forums, guards posted with uneasy stares, and whispers, always the whispers, about a man who dared to speak for the poor. His name? Tiberius Gracchus. Before we get started on this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And when we reach the end, leave your thoughts in the comments. Was Tiberius a martyr, a madman, or something far more haunting? The summer heat lay like a shroud over Rome in 133 BC. The kind that slowed even the most spirited hawker in the forum. But the air was thick not only with dust and sun, something else drifted in: tension. It hung from the terracotta rooftops and coiled around the marble columns of the Senate. People walked a little faster. Eyes lingered longer. Whispers grew sharper. And always the name floated behind them: Gracchus. Tiberius Gracchus was no ordinary man. Born to a family of prestige and married into another of equal stature, he had all the makings of a standard Roman elite. But something within him burned differently. Maybe it was the fire passed down from his mother, Cornelia, the revered daughter of Scipio Africanus. Or maybe it was something darker, deeper, a hunger to challenge what had always been. The Senate saw it. The people felt it. And Rome, ancient, proud Rome, bristled under the weight of his ideas. He walked through the city not with arrogance, but with certainty. When Tiberius spoke, he didn't shout, he carved. Each word deliberate. Each promise dangerous. Land for the landless. Limits on greed. A return to ancient values, or so he claimed. The poor loved him for it. The rich watched. Behind closed doors, the old men of the Senate gathered like buzzards. They saw a pattern, one that chilled them more than any barbarian sword. Tiberius wasn't just reforming, he was unraveling. The mos maiorum, the sacred customs of Rome, were not merely guidelines, they were the bones of the Republic. And now this tribune, still in his 30s, was cracking those bones one by one. What was next? A crown? But for the citizens, those crushed by debt, driven from their fields, forgotten in the sprawl of empire, he was hope made flesh. Farmers abandoned their fallow lands to hear him speak. Veterans returned from war only to discover their estates stolen now cheered his name in the forum. Even slaves paused in their labors, as if his voice could crack their chains by sound alone. Still, all hope comes at a cost. The city began to feel different. Not just hot, but volatile. When Tiberius proposed his agrarian reforms, a fire lit under the common people. But it also lit something else, a slow, creeping dread among the patricians. That dread turned to fury when he dared bypass the Senate entirely, taking his law straight to the assembly. It wasn't illegal, but it was unspeakable. One senator spat that Rome had seen invaders, plagues, and earthquakes, but never this. The temples, normally silent save for the soft prayers of Vestals, now echoed with political chants. In the Suburra, graffiti appeared. Gracchus gives land, the Senate gives chains. Fights broke out in bathhouses. Senators armed their clients with clubs. The old rules, once iron, were melting fast. And at the center of it all, Tiberius remained strangely calm. He walked each morning beneath the statue of Romulus, past the temples of Jupiter and Juno, greeted both friend and rival with a smile too wide to read. But his guards doubled. His friends grew quiet. Even his younger brother Gaius urged him to slow down. He didn't listen. Not because he was arrogant. Because he believed. And belief, when sharpened by power, is a blade that cuts both ways. Tiberius saw what others wouldn't. He knew the landless poor were not just desperate, they were waiting. One spark, and they would burn down the very Senate walls. He, of course, would be their matchstick. Whether he lit freedom or ruin, he had not yet decided. But others had. One afternoon, he paused on the Capitoline Hill and looked out over the city, his city. To the east, the markets boiled with noise. To the west, the Palatine shimmered in the light. And somewhere below, beyond the temples and guards and banners, death had already begun to creep toward him. It wore a white toga. It sat in a senator's chair. And it had no need for swords. The office of tribune was sacred, literally. Its occupant, chosen by the people, was supposed to be untouchable. Tiberius Gracchus knew this well. And yet, step by step, he began to test just how far that sacred shield could stretch before it shattered. Rome had seen tribunes come and go. Some loud, some pious, many forgettable. But Tiberius was different. He didn't just use the office, he expanded it, twisted it, some whispered, into a weapon. Where once a tribune defended the people, Tiberius led them. Where once a tribune tempered conflict, he fanned it. And where once a tribune served for one term and stepped aside, Tiberius made a choice that would seal his fate. He sought a second term. No one had done that in centuries. It was not illegal. That was the trouble. Rome didn't run on law alone, it ran on custom, tradition, the weight of what should be done. And Tiberius, eyes set on justice, or perhaps power, brushed that all aside like cobwebs. The Senate felt the breach like a slap to the face. To them, it wasn't a re-election. It was a coup in slow motion. The city trembled. Every corner of Roman life began to fracture. Senators paid gangs to disrupt speeches. Supporters of Tiberius threw bricks from rooftops. Forum steps became battlegrounds of ideology and blood. And all the while, Tiberius, pale-faced but undeterred, continued. He spoke in measured tones beneath the towering columns of the temple of Castor and Pollux. If the rich take all the land, he asked, what room is left for Roman virtue? The crowd roared. Women wept. Old men who'd lost their farms nodded in quiet agreement. It was not a speech, it was a summons. And the Senate heard it loud and clear. Led by Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica, a man with deep roots and even deeper grudges, the opposition began to conspire. Scipio, cousin to Tiberius and high priest of the state religion, saw more than just a political rival. He saw a heretic. A breaker of Rome's sacred order. He corrupts the people. Scipio spat behind closed doors. He defies the gods by defying our customs. And so plans were whispered in twilight shadows, plans that did not involve debates or votes. But Tiberius was not naive. He knew he walked a tightrope strung over a pit of daggers. And yet he pressed forward. Some say he felt invincible. Others say he saw no other way out. When your enemies call your name with smiles and swords alike, you learn to keep marching, even if it leads to the edge. In public, his eyes searched the faces around him, probing, questioning, always calculating. Who remained loyal? Who had been bought? Who had already decided what day he would die? His speeches became shorter, more urgent. His guards, once few, now stood shoulder to shoulder. Some of his oldest allies drifted away, warning him to temper his tone, to delay the vote for his second term. He refused. Delay was death in another form. And Rome, he believed, was running out of time. In the Senate, fear curdled into hatred. They saw what the people did not, that Tiberius had bypassed them once, he could do it again. What if he seized more power? What if he controlled both the tribunate and the assembly? What if, gods forbid, he touched the legions? Some muttered the word that had not been spoken in generations, Rex. King. Rome had bled to cast out kings centuries ago. No man, no matter how noble, could be allowed to wear that crown again. Especially not one who drew crowds as though possessed, who made the poor believe they were not powerless. So the line was drawn. Not in ink or law, but in blood yet to be spilled. As election day approached, the capital transformed into a kettle of fire. Soldiers watched from a distance, unsure whom they would serve if violence broke. Senators armed themselves under their robes. Commoners sharpened sticks. And somewhere in the crowd, death waited, not with a sword, but with a club, crude and final. On the eve of the election, Tiberius climbed the Palatine Hill alone. The city spread before him, golden in the fading sun. The rooftops glowed like embers. The Tiber shimmered like a mirror. But beneath the beauty, shadows writhed. He knew tomorrow would not be like the last. He could feel it in his breath. In the way even the wind had gone still. Rome was ready for something: change, collapse, judgment. It did not matter which. Only that it came soon. And so he stared at the city he tried to save, perhaps to command, and whispered a prayer not to Jupiter, but to his father, long dead. "If I fall tomorrow, let it mean something." He turned back to the capital. The clubs were waiting. The morning rose heavy and hot, as if the sky itself strained to bear what was coming. From every alley, archway, and tenement, Romans poured into the city center. Men clutching crude banners. Women holding children on their hips. Veterans with limps and haunted eyes. They weren't just here to vote, they came to witness. Something was going to happen. They could feel it. At the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, where the assembly was to gather, the crowd thickened like blood congealing in a wound. Dust swirled with every footstep, and every breath tasted of tension. Above them, marble gods stared blankly from their perches, unable, or unwilling, to intervene. Tiberius arrived not as a statesman, but as a marked man. He wore a dark tunic, fastened tight at the shoulders, his eyes scanning the mass like a soldier entering hostile ground. Around him, a few loyalists followed, some armed, some merely hopeful. The rest, the powerful, the silent, the plotting, watched from balconies and behind columns. He ascended the Capitol steps and stood before the people, his hand raised not in triumph, but in warning. Reports had reached him during the night, rumors of hired thugs, of clubs hidden under togas, of a Senate meeting that had not adjourned. Still he spoke. "If I fall today," he said, "remember who strikes the blow. It is not Rome. It is fear." The crowd murmured. Some applauded. Others looked nervously toward the edges of the forum where men in white robes lingered too long, too still. Then came the moment. A senator, pale and breathless, pushed through the crowd to whisper into Tiberius's ear. A grim message. It was said that his enemies had placed a diadem, a royal crown, in his home. That they would accuse him of treason before the day was through. That the Senate, still in session, was preparing to declare him a public enemy. Not a tribune. Not a Roman. A threat. Tiberius stiffened. He looked over the sea of faces, many of whom had trusted him, believed in him, staked their futures on his words. And then, without a word, he touched his head, a small gesture. To some, it meant nothing. To others, it meant everything. It was said he was signaling for protection. To the Senate watching from behind the columns, it was all the evidence they needed. The gesture was spun into prophecy. He had asked for a crown. The Republic would not wait for confirmation. Scipio Nausicaa stood, his white toga gathered in one fist, the other gripping a heavy staff. "Now," he growled. "Now, before Rome becomes a tyranny." He gave no order for arrest. No command for trial. Instead, he led a mob of senators and clients, armed not with swords, but with clubs, legs of furniture, stones wrapped in cloth, directly into the crowd. It happened fast, then slow, as all tragedies do. Tiberius's supporters tried to form a barrier. Some shouted for calm. Others begged him to flee. But the steps of the Capitol offered no retreat. Behind him loomed the temple doors, locked. Before him, chaos. The first blow landed on a man beside him, his friend, crushed under a wooden bench. A scream followed. Blood hit the stones. And then the real storm began. The crowd erupted in shrieks and panic. Bodies surged and pushed. Men fell and were trampled. Clubs rose and fell with dull, wet cracks. Tiberius tried to move, tried to reach the edge, but hands pulled him back, others shoved him forward. He lost his footing. He never saw who struck him first. A blow to the temple sent him staggering. A second snapped bone. A third caved the side of his skull. He fell, gracelessly, helplessly, on the Capitol stones, eyes wide, lips moving without sound. Someone screamed his name. But it didn't matter. The Republic had spoken. The mob did not stop. They beat the body long after it was still. Blood streamed across sacred ground. A man once wrapped in oratory, in law, in hope, reduced to meat and silence beneath the same sky he had tried to change. Around him, others died too, over 300 some say. Friends, followers, innocents crushed under sandals and fury. The air turned thick with death and dust, and somewhere someone laughed. As the attackers withdrew, a hush fell over the hill. Not peace. Something colder. Not even the gods had interfered. And in that silence, the body of Tiberius Gracchus lay sprawled, unrecognizable. The man who had dared to defy the Senate, who had offered land to the landless, now gave his blood to the stones of Rome. It would not be the last blood spilled for such dreams. Night fell over Rome like a morning veil, heavy and suffocating. The Capitol stood silent, its stones still wet from the slaughter, the echoes of screams slowly fading into whispers. But there was no time for grief. No time for ritual. What came next was not justice. It was erasure. The body of Tiberius Gracchus lay twisted on the stone steps, limbs askew, face crushed beyond recognition. Around him, the remains of his allies, men who had stood beside him in hope, were dragged away by city slaves, dumped unceremoniously into carts like refuse. The Senate, still cloaked in blood-spattered togas, convened before sunrise. They did not speak of guilt. They did not debate the deed. They discussed disposal. Scipio Nazica, who had led the attack, was unrepentant. No funeral. No shrine. No martyr, he said coldly. Let the river take what belongs to no man. Others murmured agreement. Even those who had hesitated before now nodded in grim approval. Tiberius had not just broken tradition, he had become a threat to tradition itself. And the punishment was not merely death, but oblivion. Before dawn, slaves were sent to the Capitol with orders: strip the body, bind it in burlap, and drag it to the Tiber. What followed was a spectacle as horrifying as it was deliberate. By torchlight, the lifeless form of Tiberius was pulled down from the steps, naked, bruised, faceless. His blood left a trail like spilled ink on a forgotten scroll. No prayers were offered. No family allowed to intervene. His mother, Cornelia, once hailed as the ideal Roman matron, was barred from even seeing his remains. His wife wept behind shuttered doors. His younger brother, Gaius, watched from the shadows, trembling with rage and grief that would one day ignite its own fire. And then, beneath a sliver of pale moonlight, the body was dragged through the streets. The same streets where Tiberius had once walked in triumph, where crowds had cheered his name and thrown laurel wreaths at his feet, now bore witness to his humiliation. Dogs howled. Windows shut. But eyes watched. Always there were eyes. Some say the cart broke, and the body tumbled onto the stones. That one of the city slaves recoiled in fear, as if touching the corpse would bring a curse. Others claimed the body moved, just once, a twitch of the hand, but that, too, may have been the wind. At the banks of the Tiber, there was no ceremony. No coin for the ferryman. The body was tossed into the black water like waste. It floated for a moment, bloated, broken, silent, before slipping beneath the surface. The river, ancient and indifferent, swallowed it whole. But Rome is a city that remembers through silence. Though the Senate had hoped to erase Tiberius, the opposite began to take root. Whispers returned, sharper now, like blades under the tongue. Some said the gods had wept at the Capitol, that lightning struck the Forum the following night, that the temple doors swung open on their own. Fear, once directed at the man, now clung to his absence. In the Subura and Aventine, commoners lit candles in secret. In the countryside, farmers told tales of the tribune who had tried to return the land. Mothers named their sons Tiberius. Graffiti reappeared on the walls. "You killed him, but not the cause." The Senate, sensing the change, tried to control the narrative. They branded him a traitor. They claimed he sought kingship. They paid ports to write of his arrogance. But truth, once buried, has a habit of surfacing, like a body rising from the depths. And in that rising, a shadow began to stretch over Rome. Not long after, Scipio Nausicaa, once hailed as the savior of the Republic, was quietly exiled. Officially, he was sent on a diplomatic mission to Asia. In reality, he fled. The people no longer bowed as he passed. Some spat. Some cursed. He would die abroad, far from the city he had claimed to defend, forgotten and alone. But the true legacy of that night did not lie with Scipio. It stirred in the heart of Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius. He had watched it all, helpless, burning. He had seen his brother's blood on the Senate stones, had heard the cheers of the patricians and the wails of the poor. And deep within him, something broke, and something else was born. He would wait. He would learn. And then, one day, he would return to that same capital, with the same office, the same mission, and perhaps the same end. Rome had won the battle. But the war, silent and slow, was only just beginning. The Tiber closed over Tiberius Gracchus like a curtain drawn at the end of a tragedy. But in Rome, no death ever truly ends. It lingers, in statues, in stories, in the heavy hush before a riot. And though his body was gone, stripped, drowned, and denied a grave, the idea of Tiberius rose from the depths. A year passed. Then another. The Senate congratulated itself on restoring order. The patricians rebuilt alliances. Life, on the surface, returned to normal: bread, games, votes. But beneath that calm, the foundations shifted. Something had cracked. Not everyone could see it. But those who lived near the edge, the farmers, the veterans, the laborers with cracked hands and bitter dreams, they felt it. Because Tiberius had said something Rome could not forget, that the Republic did not belong only to the rich. And once such a truth is spoken aloud, it cannot be silenced, not by clubs, not by rivers, not by time. In the years that followed, Tiberius became a name spoken in two tones: reverence and fear. In the taverns and hills, he was remembered as a martyr, a man who tried to pull justice from stone. Children played. Gracchus and the Senate, striking sticks together, shouting speeches. But in the Senate halls, his name was a ghost that walked behind every vote. Every reform proposal, every whisper of land redistribution, carried the weight of his death. And then came Gaius. Younger than Tiberius, but no less brilliant. Quieter at first, more cautious. He studied what had happened, every betrayal, every misstep, every silence, and waited. And when his time came, he stood in the same place his brother had stood, under the same sky, before the same people. But this time, he came with more than words. Gaius Gracchus re-entered Roman politics with thunder on his heels. He did not plead with the Senate. He challenged it. Grain subsidies, land commissions, citizen rights for Italian allies, his agenda burned even hotter than Tiberius's. And the people, older now, wearier, still remembered. They listened. And the Senate? They remembered too. Remembered the blood. Remembered the body dragged naked through the streets. They watched Gaius with sharpened eyes and sharpened blades. His end, too, would come violently, but not today. Today, he still breathed. And with every speech he gave, The name Tiberius flickered behind him like a shadow that could not be extinguished. The Republic found itself in a slow spiral. The balance between elite and people had fractured. Violence became more common in the assembly. Tribunes now wielded power like swords. And the precedent had been set: if the Senate disliked a voice, it could crush it. But each time it did, the ghost of Tiberius stood taller. Years later, Julius Caesar, another reformer, another name cursed and celebrated, would cross a river of his own. Some said he had studied the Gracchi carefully. That he, too, understood how to speak to the mob. That he knew how fear in the Senate could be wielded like a dagger. And then, even later, emperors came. One by one, they stood in marble courtyards declaring peace, order, eternity, while behind them the Republic rotted into history. And in that new empire, the name Tiberius Gracchus became more than a memory. It became a warning. Do not reach too far. Do not rise too fast. Do not try to save too much. But it also became a flame. Because revolutions are not born from triumph. They are born from the crushed, the drowned, the forgotten. And in every corner of Rome where the poor gathered, where soldiers remembered their dead farms, where mothers wept for sons buried without names, there, the fire of Tiberius still burned. It burned in silence. It burned in songs. It burned in every child named Tiberius, every alley that echoed with stories of justice denied. Dragged naked through the streets, beaten to a pulp, tossed into the river like refuse, yes. But forgotten? Never.